How did torture become central to the US response to the 2001 attacks on New York and Washington? What are the legacies of the US torture program? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with the leading torture scholar, Lisa Hajjar. Lisa Hajjar is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her work focuses mainly on issues relating to law and conflict. Her books include Torture, A Sociology of Violence and Human Rights. Her latest publication, The War in Court, The Inside Story of the Fight Against US Torture and the War on Terror, will be published by the University of California Press. She's a founding co-editor of Jadaliyya and a member of the editorial committee of Middle East Report. I should add that Lisa Hajjar will be speaking alongside Sinan Antoun, Deepa Kumar, Daryl Lee, and Samir Aboud this coming Thursday at a webinar organized by Security and Context on the subject of legacies and aftermaths of the US War on Terror. Further information can be found on the Jadaliyya homepage. Professor Lisa Hajjar, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you, Mouin. I'm surprised you didn't invite me earlier.
Well, better late than never.
Episode. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, it's great to have you on the show. I'll jump right into it. The United States has been heavily involved in torture for decades, whether during the war in Vietnam, the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency around the globe, or US training and assistance to some of the world's most brutal regimes. Why does 9/11 nevertheless, in your view, qualify as a watershed moment when we talk about torture?
Well, that's a great question. So I think it is very important, as you did, to take note of the fact that torture is nothing new for the United States, as in instances that you described. But what really distinguishes the torture in the context of the war on terror from earlier episodes was the fact that the Bush administration, which inaugurated this post 9/11 torture program, actually legalized torture and made it, not just an element of war fighting policy, but the strategic cornerstone of the war on terror for the first 6 years. So, for example, if we think about, the military and the CIA have different kinds of experiences with torture, and ones that, have a very unusual sort of coming together in the context of the war on terror. So, one of the periods, just to make note of a historical element, was really a turning point, a real moment of reckoning for the history of modern torture, was the Korean War, in which case US soldiers who were captured either by North Korea or China, and then were interrogated under brutal torture techniques. And an astounding number of soldiers who were prisoners of war ended up being broken extremely quickly. And so after the end of the Korean War, two things happened. The military basically devised a program called the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape Program, in which US soldiers were trained in torture techniques, particularly those that were common by some of our enemies, in the case that these soldiers would ever be captured, so that they, by having been experienced things like waterboarding or solitary confinement and other techniques, that they would be better prepared to withstand the torture. And so the SEER School sort of was an anti-torture program that was developed to sort of, embolden or protect US soldiers. But the CIA took a completely different lesson from the experiences in the Korean War, and they saw that it worked. They saw that it worked, and they wanted to figure out how. I mean, they saw that it worked in breaking people. That's where it worked. And because, of course, people can be broken. The question is the relationship between torture and truth. That's a somewhat separate story. But so that was, when the CIA embarked in the early 1950s on its program called MK Ultra. That was the name of the program. And it was all about developing techniques to manipulate the mind. So it was like this kind of mind science science and all different techniques were initiated. And then in the 1960s, in the context of the Vietnam War, the CIA was very involved, as were some special US forces, in a so-called counterinsurgency program against Viet Cong, in which some of these techniques, these torture techniques, were then adapted and propagated among the South Vietnamese police, who were sort of the people doing a lot of the torturous interrogations. The CIA sort of went out of the torture business in the 1990s as a result of revelations about this past history of torture, and its propagation among right-wing allied regimes in other countries.
Particularly Latin America, I think.
Particularly Latin America, exactly, through police training programs and others. But so after 9/11, what's becomes crucial, three things I think that really go to the question that you asked me about what is significant or distinctive about torture after 9/11. So in the immediate days after 9/11, President George W. Bush decided to make the CIA the tip of the spear in pursuing those terrorists or terror suspects that were accused or wanted for questioning about the 9/11 attacks and other terror networks. And then sometime in the fall, and so one of the reasons why the CIA was so attractive to the leaders of the executive branch was the fact that the CIA can operate in complete secrecy. I mean, everything about the CIA is classified and secret.
Off the books.
So and it was but then another thing in the fall, people both in the Pentagon and in the CIA started thinking about looking at that SEER program, which was like the torture training to help US soldiers withstand torture. And so the idea to re-engineer the SEER techniques became the kind of technical, technique-based way in which the US torture program, particularly in the hands of the CIA.
So it's almost like they reversed engineered them in order to deploy them after 9/11.
Well, that's exactly what they referred to it. They referred to it as the reverse engineering of the SEER techniques. And so so if we're thinking like military interrogation and CIA interrogations were somewhat separate. I mean, the CIA was, going after people assumed to be so-called high-value terror suspects. And so when the first supposed high-value suspect was captured in March of 2002, his nom de guerre is Abu Zubaydah. He was captured in Pakistan, and the CIA assumed that he had all kinds of information, which, just to, spoiler alert, the CIA was then and always is wrong, complete and utter intelligence failure. But they believed this guy had all this information. And so they spirited him off to a secret facility or a black site in Thailand, and then started, once the CIA sort of really takes over the interrogation of Abu Zubaydah, they brought in two contractor psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, whose only claim to fame for this kind of a role was the fact that they had been Air Force trainers of soldiers in the SEER technique. So they were the ones who really started thinking about which specific techniques could be re-engineered and used on Abu Zubaydah. So they start torturing this guy using these techniques. And then by July of 2002, the CIA starts getting worried that maybe in the future they could, individuals who are doing these things, which, clearly, obviously, are illegal, that they would face future prosecution. So one of the critical moments is when government lawyers in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, and specifically John Yoo, exactly, who was in a very tight circle of radical right-wing lawyers around Dick Cheney, who really were, all on board for taking the.
Sorry, these were operating under Ashcroft at the time?
Yes, but Ashcroft, how the eagle soars. I mean, but the Office of Legal Counsel is its own entity within the Justice Department. So the Office of Legal Counsel, it's often referred to as the government's lawyer. This is the office that's supposed to tell the government what is and isn't legal in terms of policies and practices. But John Yoo, with the encouragement of Cheney and Cheney's consigliere, David Addington, basically wanted to assuage CIA anxieties that they would not in the future be prosecuted. And so the way in which that was done was through the production of 2 memos, both of which were dated August 1, 2002. So
these are the so-called torture memos.
Right, but they were all classified, so the public didn't know any of this. But in one memo, you, who authored the memo, basically looks to the Israeli example, because Israel had, distinguished itself as the first state to legalize torture in 1987 through a reinterpretation of laws, and then the argument that national security necessity justifies and therefore legitimizes, coercive interrogation techniques. Right. So John Yoo adapts some of those arguments, also seasons them with certain US arguments to basically say that unless the interrogator's intent is to torture them, as opposed to an intent to get information out of them, so torture being the means rather than the end, right, that therefore then they wouldn't fall afoul of the US federal law that criminalizes
So
torture.
Unless it was gratuitous infliction of cruelty, it was legal.
Well, that's the way that John Yoo starts interpreting these things. And just to say, the second memo was a legal endorsement of the techniques that were already being used on Abu Zubaydah. But it was basically, it was this argument that, torture is bad, but the things the US government is doing don't constitute torture as we have redefined the law or culpability for torture. So right, that memo was written specifically for the CIA, which is a civilian agency and therefore is not subject to the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions. But the White House passed it along to the Pentagon, and then Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld and the General Counsel for the Pentagon, William Hayes, basically then used that argument to push back against, to basically provide military interrogators with the same prerogatives to torture as the CIA had already gotten. And then you get some pushback from the, the JAGs, the Judge Advocate Generals, or military lawyers.
This is within the Pentagon we're talking about.
Within the Pentagon, exactly. But they were overridden. And so, by March of 2003, Rumsfeld has signed off on very similar torture techniques that could be utilized by the military, particularly at Guantanamo. So that's a sort of how, torture gets legalized and expanded to different institutions. The one point I would just say about why, why did this happen? And that's really much more of a political question. So Dick Cheney, who was vice president, had, he's an extreme, sort of neo-sovereigntist, extreme right-winger. And he had very much resented many of the checks and balances that had been instituted against the executive branch in the wake of Watergate and the COINTELPRO spy operations, and
which is the period when he got his start in politics during the mid-70s. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the things, and then when it came to the Reagan administration and the Iran-Contra scandal, he very much opposed the majority decision that the Reagan administration had really violated the law. So one of Cheney's ongoing desires was to expand the prerogatives of the president and expand the powers, the uncheckable powers of the executive branch by cutting out congressional oversight and judicial intervention. And so, and we would call this, the kind of political position, the unitary executive thesis. So it's the idea that the president should be unfettered by law, any law, international laws or even federal laws, if the policies he's making, the practices he's authorizing are intended to, protect national security.
So to paraphrase Nixon, if the executive does it, it's legal.
Exactly. And so that's exactly what, Cheney was pushing. And we see that, to flag something that I can expand on later, but the idea is that this notion of an unfettered executive, it's something that has not gone away. Like that is a lasting legacy of, sort of less supervised, less accountable government power has gone from administration to administration since, the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
So that's what was playing out in Washington. Now let's move to what was happening around the world, and especially in the two countries that the US occupied, Afghanistan and then Iraq. Now, counterinsurgency strategies often emphasize, or is said to often emphasize, the proverbial battle for the hearts and minds of hostile populations. But against this background, how did torture, let's call it the electrification of people and prisoners rather than towns and villages, how did that become central to the war on terror? I mean, many of us remember the horrific images that emerged out of the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. But beyond lighting prisoners up like Christmas trees, rape, and murder, what were the main features of the US torture program?
Okay, what I'm going to tell you is, sort of to think about how these events unfolded over a period of months and years. So one thing that's, especially now that we have just passed the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the start of the war on terror, was the idea that the war began as a war for information, right? The 9/11 attacks were, as it was understood that those things were, unanticipated. It was an unanticipated, horrific event, and it signaled the fact that, the US intelligence agencies were not accurately and adequately on top of things to have anticipated it or prevented it or whatever. And so they really didn't even know who was involved or who was behind the 9/11 attacks. So the war on terror starts as a war for information. And the way you get information from people is by capturing them alive and interrogating them. But because of the utter intelligence failure, the United States, when the war, begins, the bombing campaign begins in October of 2001, and then boots on the ground by early November. And that's when they just start rounding up people. Like they didn't know who was who. They literally didn't know who they were looking for. So anybody who was sold for bounty to US forces or captured by the Northern Alliance, which the United States had allied with after the start of the war in Afghanistan, anybody could end up in first Kandahar. That was the original detention interrogation facility that the US used, and then shortly thereafter in Bagram. So that's one thing, you're just rounding up people. It's like it would be the similarity of racial profiling in a sort, like where people are just rounded up in order to see whether or not they're guilty. But then the problem becomes that because US interrogators didn't speak the languages, know who was who, know anything about Afghanistan, or know anything about, Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations, coupled with the decision that Bush took on February 7th, 2002, to declare that the Geneva Conventions don't apply, it really was the way in which, for military interrogators, the gloves were taken off. And then there was so much pressure from Washington to produce information, like a desperation, like everybody who passed through Bagram and was being brutally interrogated by soldiers who were responding to desperate and urgent demands from Washington for intelligence. Everybody was like, where's Osama bin Laden? Where's Osama bin Laden? I mean, that's was the question. So it was just, it was a horrific confluence of misdeeds and lack of information. And then and I know you're going to ask me next about Guantanamo, but the decision was taken to turn Guantanamo, the naval base on the south side of Cuba, which had been used as a detention facility for Haitians in the 1990s, to re-up that detention facility and move people out of the hot war zone into another place where they could be held for long-term interrogation and detention. And so basically in Bagram, every single non-Afghan who got into US custody for sale, roundups, passed over by the Pakistani security force, et cetera. Every non-Afghan was shipped to Guantanamo on the assumption that if you're not an Afghan, what are you doing in
What are you doing
Afghanistan?
here?
You must be a terrorist. And then plus they sent plenty of Afghans along as well. But that was, sort of because they literally didn't know who they had. They didn't know who they were looking for. They couldn't, it was an unprofessional interrogation system that was instituted, coupled with the declaration that there no laws apply, and that these people, that what they were referred to were PUCs, person under custody, which basically was another way of dehumanizing people to kind of grease the skids for all the violence and deprivations that followed.
So that's Afghanistan,
Mhm.
and you mentioned Guantanamo, the U.S. prison camp in Cuba, and it emerged as a microcosm of the U.S. torture program, bringing together various aspects such as renditions, torture, military tribunals, the exposure of these practices and the campaign against them. You visited Guantanamo, in fact, no less than 14 times, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And,
Yes.
and what are your main takeaways from what you saw and were permitted to see in Guantanamo during your many visits?
Okay. So, because like torture's my thing, I was, really following along from the very beginning, realizing that the US was good, sort of almost anticipating that the US would develop a torture program based on things that were happening and statements that officials were making. And then ultimately what really captures my interest was the fight against some of these prisoner policies that really begins with the late great Michael Ratner, who was then the president of the Center, or the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, who had actually fought the US government over the detention of Haitians in Guantanamo in the 1990s and won, and so when he realized that Guantanamo was going to be a site, and not just a site to be used for prisoners, but that anybody held there would be held incommunicado. So Ratner, Joe Margulis, Clive Stafford Smith, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and others start this fight against, sort of, at first it was just incommunicado detention in a place like Guantanamo, but ultimately,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but by that you mean that we weren't even supposed to know who was being held there?
Absolutely. Those names were a secret. The names of detainees were a secret. A few names of people who were the citizens of allied countries got out as like diplomatic courtesy. So in fact, when Ratner, Margulis, and Clive Stafford Smith sue President Bush, in the first case was Sewell v. Bush, they were representing those few Brits and one Australian whose identities were known among the many others whose identities were classified secrets. But so the point that I wanted to get to is that it's, it really only begins, everything was still classified and secret, et cetera. But as you had mentioned before, the Abu Ghraib scandal, because I just need to like link that back in with Iraq. I mean, it's all, this will get me back to Guantanamo in a moment, but it was the decision of the neocons to spread the war on terror to Iraq on fabricated, justifications like that, Iraq still had a weapons of mass destruction program, but more, bizarrely, that Saddam Hussein had been in alliance with Osama bin Laden, and therefore Iraq bore some responsibility for 9/11. But so the neocons bought their own nonsensical rhetoric that this would be a cakewalk. They could go in and finally finish off Saddam Hussein and they'd be greeted as liberators. And it just didn't really go that way. It went terribly, terribly badly. And so just like in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the US just started rounding up people and and there was like transfers between interrogators from Afghanistan who brought their torture skills to Iraq, et cetera. And that's what leads to the debacle that was photographed by military police themselves about the torture of some Iraqi prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prison. But it's when those photos become public in April of 2004. It's like, that's what blows the lid off all the secrets. Like, the United States does torture people, contrary to all the statements to the contrary by various
Proudly
officials.
so, one may, you could almost add.
Right. And so then it was, the pressure that the Abu Ghraib scandal put on the Bush administration forced the executive branch to start releasing a few memos and policy documents, because Congress was finally like roused from its sleepy slumber to ask what was happening in interrogation and detention facilities. And that's when those torture memos, including the infamous August 1 memo authored by John Yoo, come out. And then at the end of, that was in like sort of May and early June of 2004, on the heels of the Abu Ghraib scandal. And then at the end of June, it was the first of not very many victories, by the good lawyers, by the lawyers who were fighting the government, when, CCR et al. Won in the Supreme Court the case of Rasul v. Bush. So Rasul v. Bush essentially opens up Guantanamo to lawyers. Like, lawyers could then sign up, and 600 lawyers from all walks of the profession volunteered to serve as habeas counsels for Guantanamo detainees. So
and I think journalists were given access as well.
Journalists were allowed. I mean, like Carol Rosenberg is, really a national treasure. She was there when the first prisoners were airlifted. She's been there a lot, but there wasn't much going on in, they were allowed to, they'd been allowed to see the prisoners, but there wasn't much that the government wanted the media to report on in Guantanamo. But after, when the first lawyers begin going down to Guantanamo and meeting with these clients that they have volunteered to represent, that's when the narrative starts changing. So the point being, then my research, sort of following toward, I start doing research on the lawyers who were going to Guantanamo, et cetera. And Guantanamo seemed like a closed place. And so it was a very, as a scholar and, somebody who writes journalistically, it was very frustrating that I couldn't see for myself. Like, I had to always base whatever I was learning on interviews with people who went to Guantanamo, who particularly those lawyers, as well as military lawyers, the first batch of military lawyers who were assigned to represent the first detainees who were slotted for prosecution in the presidentially created military commissions. So, but it wasn't until 2010 and 2010, of course, is the Obama administration. So the Obama administration, while Obama technically ended the torture program officially in January of 2009, he decided to keep Guantanamo open, or he was unable to, close it. And he also decided to use the military commissions. And the first person that was prosecuted under Obama, the putative constitutional law professor, rights, respecting liberal, was Omar Khadr, a Canadian citizen who'd been captured in Afghanistan in July of 2002 when he was 15 years old, and transported to Guantanamo in October of 2002, shortly after he turned 16. So the first person to be prosecuted under Obama was this, child, so-called child soldier. And so I was watching reading, so there were journalists down there at the trial, and it was all about, what statements that Omar Khadr made to interrogators would be allowed to be used, because of the fact that the defense teams were, defense lawyers were arguing that he'd been tortured. And it was so frustrating for me, this is like April, May of 2010, to have to, the only way I could access what I wanted to write about and study and understand
indirectly.
was indirectly. And so then, in June, I met with a psychologist named Kate Porterfield in New York, and she was had been working with Omar Khadr because her specialties include victims of torture and child survivors of war, of which Omar Khadr was both. And she was scheduled to go back to Guantanamo when the hearings resumed, the following month. And, so we were having a conversation. I was like, oh, I wish I could go. Or she looked at me and said, I wish you could be there. And I was like, I wish I could be there too. And then she said, well, you could go if you went as a journalist. And it was like, ding, 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 ding. I write journalistically. And so I will give the Pentagon credit for one thing. They have no litmus test for journalists. And so I started going, and which isn't to say, I do write journalistically, but I started going to Guantanamo. I went down for all of the hearings in the Omar Khadr case. And then in December 2013, I started going and went another 11 times, mostly for hearings that have been ongoing in the 9/11 case. And that's 5 people who spent years in CIA custody being brutally tortured, whom the government is now trying to prosecute in the military commission.
This is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
And 4 others. And so, they were arraigned under Obama in 2012. It's 2021. They are nowhere near ending the pretrial phase of that case because of the fact that they were tortured by the CIA, that the secret, that the details of their torture continue to be highly classified secrets, and the government wants to, this is a capital case, the government is seeking the death penalty. And so what, I'm really bad at math, 2012 to 2021, it's like nine years of pretrial hearings,
but
basically illustrate no justice with torture.
But you're saying they were only charged in 2012.
They were actually charged for the second time. The Bush administration charged them in 2008. That was going to be like the way that Bush was going to go out, prosecuting the alleged mastermind of 9/11, getting them found guilty and executing them. But the case fell apart in December of 2008 when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the main of the 5 defendants, sort of said that he would be willing to plead guilty immediately on the condition that he go directly to execution. And then some of the others also, said, yeah, we want to do that too. But the law governing the military commissions doesn't allow people to plead into a death sentence. So the case fell apart. And then, Obama wanted to try them in New York, but then that idea fell apart. And then they were recharged in 2012. So the case now is referred to as KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's initials, 2. Denoting that this is the second bite at the military commission.
And we're still in the pretrial phase.
Still in the pretrial phase. It just had hearings, over the 20th anniversary period, but I wasn't able to go. I wanted to go, because I wanted to be at Guantanamo because I've been following this case and it had been suspended for 18 months because of COVID. And I wanted to be at Guantanamo for the 20th anniversary of 9/11, but unfortunately, and I go reporting from Middle East Report, there were, as the very nice, public affairs people in the Pentagon would say, there's too many major media that want to go, so there was no space for me, so I couldn't go. So I'll go back when the major media lose their interest in the arcane motions battles that have defined this case.
Well, you've referred several times to the 20th commemoration of 9/11. And looking back, what are the main legacies of 2 decades of the U.S. torture program? Is it appropriate or too early to speak of it in the past tense?
It's definitely not too early to speak for it. And I can give you several examples that illustrate that point. So while Obama, by signing an executive order on his second day in office, he signed 3. One was close Guantanamo. That didn't work out so well. Another was suspend the military commissions, which were then brought back online. But the third one was to take the CIA out of the interrogation and detention business, which for all intents and purposes, and formally sort of ending torture. But here's why the legacies are, we can't say we're after torture for several reasons. One, there was absolutely, torture is a crime. And it's not just a regular run-of-the-mill crime. It is a crime whose neighbors are war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. It's one of the gross crimes under international law. But there was never any accountability for any of the intellectual authors or perpetrators of US torture. So
that was going to be my next question, is has there been any reckoning?
No. So, I mean, this is one example that there's been, so by not holding anybody accountable for the crime of torture, and Obama, went further and said, everybody who was involved in the torture program was acting in good faith. And the good faith was because they basically, government lawyers had legalized what they were doing at that time period. So even if the policy changes, the lack of accountability is, a major problem. I mean, so not just a problem that the people responsible for torture weren't prosecuted, and some of them, were promoted to higher things, but the fact that sequence of events has actually made it very difficult, if not impossible, for average Americans or even the US legal system to accurately understand what is torture and what is wrong with torture. I mean, we don't even have that story. But the other significant example is the fact that although the torture program ended in terms of the use of those techniques in the interrogation of detainees, the fact that the CIA, everything about it remains classified. And so there is this important and devastating chapter of US history, which was the focus of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, did a report, started out bipartisan. The report was, concluded in 2012, harshly critical of the CIA for saying that the interrogation techniques they were authorized to use didn't work, it endangered US security, et cetera. But because the Senate report was so critical of the CIA program, all the CIA defenders and torture enthusiasts, sort of rallied against it. And what's happened is that all the public has ever seen is a heavily redacted executive summary of the SSCI report. But that 6,300 page report, which is not the only one, but one authoritative accounting of the CIA's torture program, is locked away. And and so that inability to even know what our government did and why, or the details, that is another enduring legacy.
You keep talking about the CIA, but earlier you made the point that what changed after 9/11 was that both the CIA and the regular military were given legal authorization to engage in these practices.
Right. Well, so the critical actor in that, and thank you very much for reminding me, one of the critical actors in dragging the military back out of the torture program was Republican Arizona Senator John McCain, who himself had been a prisoner of war and had been brutally tortured when he was captured in North Vietnam for 5 years, and who's always been a very staunch anti-torture person, not so much because of any sympathy for those, America's enemies, but rather on the grounds that, torture doesn't work, that, authorizing soldiers to utilize torture degrades the military and it damages US, national interests. So McCain, particularly because, soldiers who were involved or aware of, military interrogational abuses started contacting McCain. And there were, of course, NGOs, operating on this level too. And McCain basically fought his own party and the Bush administration by authoring an amendment to the defense spending bill of 2005. It is called the McCain Amendment. And its original aim was to prohibit any use of violent, psychological or physical tactics by US interrogators, by all of them. Cheney loses his shit. It's one thing for the military to be, McCain to be a terrorist, sympathizing, whatever, but leave the CIA alone. And so there was a battle. McCain battled it out with the White House in the fall of 2005. And finally, McCain was worn down or broken. Let's say the White House broke him. And so he agreed to add a CIA exception to the prohibition. So the McCain Amendment essentially takes the military back out of the formally legal policy position of torture, but it carved out that CIA exception.
I see. So we're talking again about what was happening in Washington, and looking more broadly within the U.S. Has the U.S. torture program that took place in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere abroad, has it had an influence domestically within the United States?
I mean, yeah, many influences. And, you know, one of the things when I first started, you know, focusing on torture in the context of the war on terror was many of my friends, dear friends and colleagues who work on, you know, prison abuse and the horrific conditions in US prisons, you know, and especially after the Abu Ghraib scandal came out, were frustrated that there was, you know, not very many, but some people who were like loudly opposing torture of foreigners abroad, that, you know, the idea that it wasn't really, you know, that it was ignoring or or understating the significance of the fact that many of the, particularly long-term isolation and sleep deprivation that are, you know, techniques that are found in US prisons, that was getting, you know,
like
short
prolonged
shrift.
solitary confinement, basically.
Prolonged solitary confinement and all kinds of other, you know, maybe not waterboarding, et cetera. But the thing is that, you know, in the context of, while the torture program, both military and civilian and CIA was operating, I mean, some of the people who were brought in to be interrogators were, you know, police officers, you know, who use torture in their domestic thing. And particularly, you know, Chicago had a notorious torture problem. And so some of the infamous police torturers were actually put on reserve duty, brought down to Guantanamo. One of them is a guy named Richard Zuley, who led the brutal interrogation of a Mauritanian named Mohamedou Salahi. And he basically was bringing in all kinds of abusive techniques that he had, you know, sort of perfected on poor people, people of color in the Chicago area, in order to force them to confess falsely often to things. And so that he was, you know, he was let loose on Salahi. And that's, you know, so part of this, you know, I mean, Zuley has never been held accountable. No one has been held accountable. So in some ways, that's part of this, you know, why we can't say we've turned the page on this chapter.
Yeah, so just one last point on this. I mean, when we talked about accountability, you spoke about those who were directly involved in terms of government officials writing torture memos, perpetrators and so on. But where do people like James Mitchell fall into this, who were, my understanding is they were kind of hired as torture consultants?
Well, no, they were actually the torturers. So Mitchell and Jessen, but mostly Mitchell, actually testified in the 9/11 case, you know, because the defense lawyers called them. Mitchell took, you know, Mitchell's been the much more talkative of the two of them. Ever, you know, he's the one who published an autobiography.
He seems very proud of his work from the interview.
In fact, so when he was on the stand in January of 2020, I was there, you know, he was basically saying that, you know, he was asked by his government to help fight terrorists who had killed 3,000 people. And so then he, you know, he utilized his, you know, seer skills. But so he's never been prosecuted. However, because he and Jessen, excuse me, were contractors and not CIA employees, they're the two that have kind of been put out to, I mean, if there have been legal cases, you know, that there have been civil suits, for example, against Mitchell and Jessen, you know, and then the government has stepped in and paid, like they lost, and the government stepped in and paid the money that was
the damages
awarded to plaintiffs. But now there's a new case, you know, that U.S. and European lawyers are pursuing a case in the European Court of Human Rights for the torture of Abu Zubaydah, and they want Mitchell and Jessen to be subpoenaed to testify for the European Court of Human Rights. The government, and that was both the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, are opposing, you know, that idea. And so one of the original lawyers, Joe Margulis, who's also one of Abu Zubaydah's lawyers, there's now a Supreme Court petition to get the Supreme Court to find against the government and allow Mitchell and Jessen to be called to testify in the European Court of Human Rights. Because frankly, the European context, there hasn't been any accountability, but Europe is a more fertile ground for future accountability for the crime.
And are those the only cases you're aware of where there are active attempts to seek accountability for this whole affair?
There have been a number of cases, not many, but there were cases in Germany, cases in Spain, efforts to get Rumsfeld when he was in France, et cetera, but none of them really moved very far. These are like, universal jurisdiction cases where national prosecutors were seeking to prosecute people associated with the U.S. torture program in foreign courts under the doctrine of universal jurisdiction. But the place where there has been some accountability has been the European Court of Human Rights. And so the cases have been not about criminal accountability, but rather the countries that allowed the CIA to operate black sites on its territory, Poland, Romania, Lithuania. And then there was also Macedonia was involved in a kidnapping case of a German citizen. So the European Court of Human Rights has ruled on behalf of some of the former CIA detainees. And now there's an action, I don't know much about it, but in the American, the American Court of Justice, which deals with the Americas.
Right. Lisa Hajjar, it's been anything but torture. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and insights with Connections.
Thank you.
And also special thanks. Please.
Okay, to say one thing, like many of these little nuggets of facts are part of the book that will hopefully be out in 2022. We mentioned it, but it's
we're very much looking forward to it. And also just to remind again that you and others will be speaking at the webinar this Thursday, organized by Security in Context on legacies and aftermaths of the war on terror. And also special thanks to Arish Faisal for her technical support. Thank you very much.
Thank you.